Welcome everyone to the stream. Hello, truth seekers. I'm back. I've got a very special guest with us today. Her name is Kerry McDonald. She is a Harvard master's graduate. She wrote a book called, or she's currently working on a book called Unschooling. And for those of you who have young children like I do, this is something I feel very, very passionate about. And so for the last probably 2 months, I've been catching up on her articles about all the benefits of unschooling, about the ways that children can be involved in it, and helping parents overcome the anxieties of unschooling, like the ones that I have, and I'll be asking her about. So Kerry McDonald, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for your patience, and I'm really glad to have you. How are you?
Thanks for having me, TJ.
So I've got a list here of some of my favorites, and before we get into that, I just want to tell you one of the things that really spurred this, because I've done a couple videos on education lately. The Red for Ed craze is really big out here, and the fact that my niece in California came home from school one day with a packet. And I don't know if it was sex ed or if they just give this to kids in California, but essentially it was a pretty thick packet, and it had all the different things the kids were going to need to know to have a fulfilling sex life. And some of the things that were in there I don't really want to say online because I'm already worried about getting shadow banned. But when her parents went to confront the school, they said, "Oh, we're really sorry you feel that way." She goes, "Can you send me the link where this is posted?" And she actually had to go into the school, and then they couldn't produce it for her. They had to basically print it out and have her come back. And it was the Kama Sutra for 15-year-olds, and they were 7. So I'm kind of on this crusade of why are they doing this? When the math, reading, and science scores are plummeting, why are they focused? It's kind of like San Francisco, where there's poop all over the streets, and they're banning straws. So kind of give me your background on how this started for you in terms of the unschooling project.
Sure. So I first became interested in homeschooling and alternative education when I was an undergraduate in college in the late 1990s. I was an economics major, but an education minor, and I had an opportunity for one of my education senior seminars to do a project on alternative education, and I came across this idea of homeschooling, which was completely foreign to me. I went to public schools, K through 12. Didn't know any homeschoolers. Homeschooling at that time was still a relatively recent phenomenon, hadn't really hit the mainstream. Homeschooling just became legal in all 50 states by 1993. So it really wasn't sort of the popular movement that it's become. And it was fascinating to me to explore what homeschooling was like. And I had a classmate who had some family members who lived nearby and enabled me to shadow them and see what learning was like for them. And it was such a stark contrast compared to that same semester when I was in a public elementary school second grade classroom doing a student teaching practicum. And it couldn't have been more different. These two learning environments, sort of this family-centered, home-based learning, community immersion that I saw in the homeschooling family, and then juxtaposed with the second grade classroom, which was really much more coercive and focused on sort of command and control and top-down curriculum and what you imagine of a public school. And so this really spurred more interest in alternative education for me, and specifically not just alternative schools, but alternatives to school, like homeschooling. So I went to graduate school in education policy at Harvard. I became increasingly interested in these topics, but it wasn't until about a decade later when I became a mom and was looking at education options for my own kids that I revisited homeschooling and felt that it really fit our family very well, focused on a lot of what we valued as a family, and found my way to unschooling or self-directed education.
So what do you say to those, like, let's say my wife, for instance, who has a lot of anxiety and doesn't think that she has the super mom gene and that she's not going to be successful homeschooling the kids because there's just too much I don't want to speak for her, but it's a lot of work, a lot of time, and you have to, the one thing I like about it is you have to master the subjects, and you have to make sure you know more than your kids, which in a lot of cases for parents might not be that appealing, and it might give them a little bit of consternation, a little bit of dissonance.
Well, I have sort of the flippant remark to that is, if you went through schooling and you don't feel like you're able to then, help your kids with these subjects, what does that say about the schooling you received, right? I think parents don't give themselves enough credit. I think parents are incredibly capable of helping to facilitate their children's learning. And a lot of that is acknowledging the astounding ways that children are able to educate themselves when they're following their own interests. And certainly they need parents, they need grown-ups around them to help facilitate those interests and connect them to resources and sort of augment their learning. But children are incredibly capable learners. And I think parents have, tremendous capacity in helping to facilitate that. And I also think, nowadays, much in a much different way than it was in the late 1990s when I first encountered homeschooling as a researcher. There are over 2 million homeschoolers in the U.S. right now. And with that sort of explosion in the homeschooling population, there's a tremendous amount of resources for homeschooling families. So local organizations, museums and libraries and businesses and other kinds of local organizations really reach out to homeschoolers, provide lots of activities and programming for homeschoolers. There's families that band together to create homeschooling co-ops. There's self-directed learning centers sprouting across the country. So it's definitely not a go-it-alone phenomenon. Homeschoolers are quite connected and have many resources available to them now.
Yeah, the co-op is appealing. I said, we already carpool. Let's just take them somewhere else. We'll stop at someone's house instead of the school. So I've got a list of your comment about my education. That hit home. That stung a little bit. That's so true. Anytime I don't know something, I was publicly schooled. Like what in Sweden, I read an article the other day that they have migrants who are having a rape problem and they're trying to train them not to do it because they say, hey, we didn't know it was wrong. So anytime I didn't know something obvious, I go, public school. You can't hold me accountable for that. It wasn't my fault. You've written several excellent articles. I'm kind of torn here because in the limited time we have, the one that caught my attention was about the mass shooting epidemic, and basically the point that if you want to save your kids from mass shootings, don't put them in a place where they're happening, and they're becoming more common in schools per the stats. So that's one thing I definitely want to touch on because that's what kind of hooked me and drew me into your work. But a couple of the topics I'll throw out there, and we can decide where to go from that direction. You've got the fidget spinners, which is fascinating to me. You talk about how the reason fidget spinners were so popular amongst kids is because of command and control education systems. You talk about how factory-like schools are the child labor crisis of today, and you talk about the teen suicide epidemic and how it corresponds with the school year. So, can we start with mass shootings and then go to teen suicide? Because I definitely want to get your take on both of those.
Well, I think they're related, so I think we should start there. So, interestingly, researchers discovered that there's a seasonality to suicide, and there is in all populations. Adults there also have sort of seasonality to suicides, but what they found was that in teenagers, it's the opposite of adults. So adults have suicide spikes in the summer months, in July and August, and for teenagers, the suicide rates went way down in summer and popped right up again, skyrocketing in September. So teenage suicide rates are directly linked to the school year, to the academic year. And that, I think, is really striking. And it's one thing, it's sort of another reason why we really should be looking at schooling as a potential root of the problem in terms of childhood and adolescent angst, rising rates of suicide, depression, and anxiety, and then how that relates, of course, to mass shootings. Because I think that this data show that schooling is a real culprit. And what you'll often hear people say, oh, no, it's social media. It's this constant connectivity that adolescents are experiencing now, and
sure.
Cyberbullying and all of that's leading to increased anxiety, depression, and suicide. And that may be true. I mean, I think cyberbullying is a real phenomenon, certainly, but it doesn't explain sort of the seasonality of suicide because kids are still connected on social media in the summer. So there's something more going on, and I really think it's the confinement of children and adolescents in these compulsory schooling environments, particularly in those adolescent years, when they're sort of meant to come of age fully immersed in an authentic community, working with other adults and their peers, and instead we're enclosing young people, particularly teenagers, in these confined coercive learning spaces for much more of their time and more of their adolescence than we ever have before. I mean, in fact, there's recent data by the Bureau of Labor Statistics that shows that currently teenagers are not working in summer jobs or part-time work after school, sort of plummeting in just a generation. So we're really not providing opportunities for sort of authentic immersion and for teenagers to come of age in their communities, doing real work. Instead, we're confining them more and more in these coercive schooling spaces.
You talk about, you kind of tie these all together, in my opinion. You can tell me if this is wrong, but I see your thesis is that you take what you just said and you combine it with the absence of free play and the controlled curriculum. And then you also talked a lot in the mass shooting one about how school it kind of promotes the building up of cliques and identity, basically the identity politics in school, where you band up with a certain group, depending on how you dress, how you talk, what you say. And you look at bullying and say, well, that's how, I mean, is that making bullying worse? Because you see anti-bullying campaigns everywhere. And by the way, I like what Greg Gutfeld said in his book. He goes, the problem with bullying is everyone is being bullied. No one stands up and says, yes, I'm the bully and I'm the best at it. Even the bully will get punched in the face every now and then and go, wait a minute, why are people hitting me? I'm being bullied. It's 100% bullies, bullied and no bullies. And the school system seems to promote that because of the way kids are confined and controlled and kind of have to click up. And you talk about ideas like inequality and the lack of free play and just the mindset of being kind of put into groups and treated as such in school, like a hierarchy, so to speak.
Right. So my colleague at the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, which is a national nonprofit that works to kind of promote and foster these ideas of self-directed learning, is Dr. Peter Gray, who's a psychology professor at Bowdoin College and an unschooling advocate. And he writes a lot on his blog at Psychology Today about coercive schooling and the impact of coercive schooling. And one of his, I think, very compelling articles was about rampant bullying and its link to compulsory schooling systems. He talks about, if you look at where bullying occurs, it occurs most of the time in places where people don't have the ability to leave, where they have no agency. So, for example, he says it happens a lot in prisons. And of course, it happens a lot in schools because kids are forced by law to be there unless some generous adult removes them for some alternative learning environment.
Fascinating.
So, right. So bullying is really a condition of these coercive spaces. If you're not able to leave, think about it. If you're in a workplace and you're being bullied, you have lots of different options. You can certainly start off by trying to deal with the perpetrator, talk to human resources, see if you can get a transfer to a different department, for example. But in the end, you also have the ability to quit, to leave, to remove yourself from that bullying environment. And kids don't have that option.
So if I'm being a cynic, which I always am, you're analogizing prisons with schools. And so in a prison, we would laugh if they said, hey, prisoners, just be nice to each other. Like, bullying is not appropriate. You should treat each other with respect. But it appears that in schools, that's not working either. And so our kids, what's the prisoner mindset? Why do kids behave that way, even though they are good kids and not bad criminals like in prison? What's the data say?
Yeah, they're stripped of their autonomy and their agency. They're forced to be there by law, and they cannot leave. And so whenever you sort of force humans into these coercive spaces where they're not able to leave, and then in particularly the case of schools, they can't even sort of manage their own bodily functions without permission. They need, permission to go to the bathroom.
That's true.
We think about 18-year-olds, right? This is sort of a bit of a tangent, but we expect 18-year-olds to go off and sort of be adults and be self-sufficient and become immersed in the real world when, a few months ago, we were asking them to raise their hand to go to the bathroom. It's just this really odd place, particularly where we put teenagers. And then we wonder why, adolescents have skyrocketing rates of suicides over the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, we definitely want to talk about suicide. But as you were talking about this, I was thinking about when I read the fidget spinner article, and I was kind of going back and forth between, is this ridiculous or is she exactly right on this? I'm not sure. I need to keep reading because my kid and all his neighborhood friends are obsessed with fidget spinners. So you obviously put out the idea that that gives them their little pocket of control in a completely controlled environment. And when I talk about that idea, I use crosswalk theory. Since I was 16 years old, I've noticed that when you go up to a crosswalk and someone's using it, they either speed up or they slow down. And I always felt like if someone slows down, that's their opportunity to have control in a world where they feel like they control nothing. And so I don't even get angry. I go, you know what? I'm totally yours for the next 10, 15 steps. You're my master. But in terms of the fidget spinners, I laugh because I think you're right. I read a quote the other day about how no matter how poor, impoverished, or oppressed a man is in his own home, he has total control. He's the master. And then I realized I went to work and half the people at my work were using fidget spinners. And I thought, man, maybe I need to get out of here. This is a bad omen. So talk about how that relates to the school shooting epidemic. I definitely want to dive into that.
Sure. So fidget spinners, fidget toys were kind of all the rage back in 2017. I think the fad may have passed by a bit, but there was a lot of complaints from school administrators and teachers that fidget spinners were distracting students from real work that they were supposed to be doing in schools, and in fact, many schools were starting to ban them. And it just prompted me to say, let's look at what the fidget spinner craze is really telling us. This doesn't mean that kids who learn in non-coercive learning environments or alternative learning spaces aren't playing with fidget spinners. My kids love fidget spinners. But it doesn't have that sort of survival mechanism that I think we find in schools, where kids are often using fidget spinners as one method of regaining control over their daily life. They're sort of every bit of their time and their body is managed by others. And so fidget toys, and the same thing with Snapchat or social media, there are all of these mechanisms that kids, especially adolescents, are really grasping at to provide some semblance of control over their otherwise programmed lives. Oh, you there, TJ?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
I can now, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I went on mute because I was having a Hillary coughing spell. Talk to us about the connection between that and the increased levels of teen depression, teen anxiety, and and teen mass suicide and mass shootings in school. I've seen the data, I've read the articles. Talk to us about how those things are going to get worse and not better under the current education settings.
Well, there's a few things going on. For one, young people are spending much more time in school today than they ever did before. So one of the criticisms that some people might say is, well, I went to school, I was fine, I wasn't depressed, or if I was, it wasn't a big deal. I certainly wasn't going, entertaining ideas of mass shootings and suicide and so on. But a lot has changed in schooling in just one generation, since even when we went to school. Schooling itself has increased from an average of 5 hours a day in the early 1980s to an average of 7 hours a day in 2002, 2003. That's for the youngest children, ages 6 to 8, and it's gone up for all ages. And then along with that is what I touched on earlier, the Bureau of Labor Statistics saying that 42% of teens were enrolled in school in July of 2016 compared to only 10% in July of 1985. So they're spending much more time in school, not playing, not participating in part-time jobs, particularly as teenagers. Are we really surprised that when we confine young people in these coercive learning spaces where they have no autonomy and no real world immersion in their larger community with sort of an integrated population of all ages and different occupations, lots of different people, instead they're combined in these sort of age segregated schooling environments, are we surprised that it's leading them to have some serious mental health issues? I don't think we should be.
So, you know what, there's a couple other things I want to touch on quickly, because you've got a lot of suggestions and ideas for how people get started and what the benefits are. You're a homeschooling mother yourself. So attack this myth of institutionalized learning. I want to talk about one other theme, and that's when you wrote an article called How Mass Schooling Perpetuates Inequality. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there's this idea that mass schooling provides equal opportunity for, upward mobility, social mobility. And I think what we find, though, in the case of coercive schooling environments, of mass schooling environments, is that instead schooling very often embeds and perpetuates disadvantage. So that the young people who come into schools from disadvantaged backgrounds end up having those disadvantages amplified throughout their schooling. They get tracked and labeled and medicated, and it's difficult to kind of find the opportunity in coercive schooling.
I've got a quote here I wanted to share, actually two, if I can find the other one. John Dewey, who's considered the father of modern education. When I went to the Red for Ed rally, I was asking teachers if there's any correlation between increased spending and increased school performance. There's not. There's potentially, you could say, a negative correlation. Well, I asked questions about how the increased funding, because in Arizona, if you didn't know, Kerry, they're asking for $700 million in additional school funding, and it's going to fix everything. Like schooling will just automatically get fixed and everyone will be happy, which I'm really excited about. But I went with a chart that Cato has about all the additional staff and support that have been added over the past 30 years and the school performance, which is basically a flat line, and said, help me, like, you're an educator, educate me on this. Help me understand how this works. And I got kicked out of the event because I wasn't helping. But I would read the quote also. I had a little cardboard cutout that said, John Dewey told us the great task of the school is to counteract and transform the influence of home and church. Is that something you agree with or disagree with? And then I need to find the other quote where he basically talked about we need to help students do what their parents and grandparents did imperfectly, perfectly. And he was referring to the institutionalized industrial era of making good workers and people who are amenable to the elites in society to do what they're told to do, basically. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just an example of paternalism that continues to exist in schooling today. This idea that we can sort of people shape, that we can, that we have this sort of audacity to say that we know better, or that elites know better, how an individual or a group of people should be educated, can be educated, and I think that what we're seeing as sort of an antidote to that is the rising popularity of homeschooling and other alternatives to school that are really putting parents back in the driver's seat in a way that hasn't really happened since before the first compulsory schooling statute passed in Massachusetts in 1852. Prior to that, there was sort of a wide variety of schooling options, and homeschooling was quite ubiquitous. But government schooling became compulsory then in 1852. It's since expanded exponentially. I mean, it's sort of laughable when we think about that original law only required kids ages 8 to 14 to attend school 12 weeks a year, of which 6 had to be consecutive. That's a joke compared to the amount of time that kids are spending in school today, and particularly in the last 10 to 20 years. As I just, shared that statistic now, kids are in school almost, all year and are not doing the other things like playing or working that they would have been doing even a generation ago. So I think homeschooling really is providing the antidote to that, and other alternatives to school, or other alternative to school mechanisms like school choice mechanisms that put parents back in the driver's seat to take control back from government bureaucrats to do what's right for their children's education.
So in terms of what we do going forward, you wrote a great article called Education Needs to be Uberized, and you've talked about the spontaneous order. I've read in other places about the inherent genius and creativity in children, and basically the education system stamps that out. So a lot of them end up doing things that they really aren't in their wheelhouse in terms of what they would have been great at. What are the steps for someone like me or people listening who said, you know what, Kerry, I love everything you say. I have the same concerns. What do I do? Your book's not coming out till next year, which I'll definitely link to. So what do I do until then? What do we do?
Well, you're lucky, TJ, in Arizona. You have a robust school choice system. So you have a growing number of alternative schools and alternatives to school available to you. So I think we need to be encouraging more school choice mechanisms. Today is Milton Friedman's birthday. And Milton Friedman was the Nobel Prize winning economist who first popularized the idea of vouchers for schools, basically giving parents back control over their children's education by giving them a portion of their tax dollars back so they could choose where to send their kids to school. And vouchers are now in 15 states plus the District of Columbia. And other school choice mechanisms like education savings accounts and tax credit scholarships are also expanding nationally. And Arizona is certainly in the cutting edge of that. So I think it's looking at various options and also supporting these alternatives and these school choice mechanisms for more families. And then for families that are interested in kind of real true family-centered learning that homeschooling and unschooling provide, it's acknowledging that there are lots of resources that these families may not even know exist. So if you just Google homeschooling and whatever your local area is, or your nearest city, for example, you should find a multitude of information and resources about homeschooling so that it's not just sitting around a kitchen table having the parent educate their children. It's so much more diverse now, so many more resources available to really complement learning in so many different ways.
The forthcoming book is Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, which is something I'd certainly like to do so I can break the poor education cycle that we've had in my family, as evidenced in the disparity between our conversation, between you and I. She's got a Master's of Education Policy from Harvard University. You can see Kerry's work in Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Natural Mother Magazine, Fee.org, and Intellectual Takeout. I'd strongly encourage you to do that, as well as going to her blog, Whole Family Learning, and following her on social media. Kerry, I certainly appreciate your time and your work, and I wish you a lot of luck going forward in your efforts.
Thanks.